Good afternoon, and we'll continue with what we have started discussing, that is Gerald Prince, Narratee and Narrator. Now, what's a narrative? As we had already discussed it in the previous talk, I would repeat here once again. Narrative may be defined as representation of real or fictive event and situations in a time sequence. So, however, not all representation linked to dimension of time, however, constitute narrative. So, for narrative, temporal sequence has to be there both. So, for a narrative to take place, there has to be temporal sequence at both the level, the representational level as well as the represented level, which means that not only the representation needs to be in a temporal sequence, but that which is represented, that is the situation or the event, whichever way you put it, that is the world represented. We call it as the world represented. Okay, so the world that is represented, the event that is represented, the situation that is represented, whichever way you put it, even that should have a temporal dimension, or better put, a temporal sequence. So it is crucial to remember that not everything that takes time will have their representation as constituting a narrative. For example, there was a fight yesterday. So even though here in the statement there was a fight yesterday, even though the event here, that is fight, does have a component of time in the way that fight does take time, okay, therefore suggestive of time, or in other words has a temporal dimension, it does not constitute a narrative in itself. Why? Because there was a fight. This event does not constitute a narrative, as fight is not represented as a series of events, but rather it is represented as one event. So the temporal dimension is there, but not temporal sequence, right? Therefore, it's not a narrative. For narrative is defined as representation of real or fictive event and situation in a time sequence. So even if a sentence, however interesting, however uninteresting, may still satisfy the definition and may be said to constitute a narrative. For example, consider this statement from Prince: Mary drank a glass of juice, then she drank a glass of milk. And for example, a sentence like, all men are mortal, right? So on the one hand, if Mary drank a glass of juice, then she drank a glass of milk, will constitute a narrative. A sentence like, all men are mortal, will not constitute a narrative. So simple sentences like, John opened the door. I gave this example in the previous talk as well. I'm repeating here. John opened the door. Now the question is, does this constitute a narrative? It might appear so, because the sentence does refer to a series of situations which may be restated as, let's say, statement 1, the door was closed, right, comma, then John opened the door. This is situation 2. Let's take this as situation 2. So again, I start from the beginning. John opened the door. This appears to be a narrative because it is suggestive of a sequence, right? It is suggestive of a series of situations that can be restated, reconstituted, and again put in as. So for example, let's say situation 1, with the door was closed. Then, so you write the sentence like this: the door was closed, then John opened the door, and then the door was open. So as you can notice here, there are 3 situations that we are talking about. First situation, the door was closed. Second situation is followed by the first situation. Then John opened the door. And the third situation is followed by the second one, which is then the door, follows the second one, sorry, then the door was open. And yet this is not, or does not constitute as a narrative, because two of the three events or situation evoked as taking place in the world represented are presupposed or entailed by the third. Now this is what Prince further specifies about what should constitute a narrative, and therefore calls for a redefinition of narrative, which is that narrative is the representation of at least two real or fictive events or situation in a time sequence, neither of which presupposes or entails the other. So narrative is the representation of at least two. Here at least two is important to keep in mind. And also the last part of the definition. So narrative is the representation of at least two events, whether real or fiction, event or situation, and in a time sequence. So narrative is a representation of at least two real or fictive event or situation in a time sequence, neither of these situations presupposes or entails the other. So there is no fixed presupposition, there is no fixed bearing. Therefore, a statement like at 2 a.m. yesterday the US declared war on England, this shall constitute a narrative, despite it describing a single event, because here it works as a news story in the sense that you have at your disposal a variety of situations that can precede this situation that is represented here, without any of that necessarily preceding or entailing the given situation. So for example, a possible reconstruction of this statement can go like this: no one ever expected that US would ever decide to declare war on England, and yet at 2 a.m. yesterday the US declared war on England, and then as a result most of us were surprised. So all these situations, most of us were surprised, then no one ever expected that US would ever decide to declare war on England, and then the other situation, which was a given situation in the first instance, at 2 a.m. yesterday the US declared war on England. Now this, in this sentence, if you mark situation 1 as the one which is given at 2 a.m. yesterday, US declared war on England, this is one situation, and then the other situation is this: a result, most of us were surprised. As a result, most of us were surprised. And another situation was the previous, the preceding situation that we somehow that has been used for reconstruction. No one ever expected that US would ever decide to declare war on England. Now you see that the situation, this let's call this situation 3, no one ever expected that US would, numbering it for the sake of our understanding, no one ever expected that US would ever decide to declare war on England. This is situation 3. And at 2 a.m. yesterday the US declared war on England. This is the situation that was given. Whether this constitutes a narrative or not, that is what we are trying to say. And then there's another situation: as a result most of us were surprised. Let's say this is situation 2. So any other reconstruction was possible with any change of situation. This situation 3 and 2 could have been anything, anything else, not exactly this what has been used for reconstruction. So it is not binding. Therefore what one is trying to say is that situation 3 and 2, as mentioned here in the example that I have given, is not it's not necessarily dependent on situation 2, or neither situation 1, which is the given situation at 2 a.m. yesterday US declared war on England. This is neither presupposes any of the situation 3 or 2, nor entails any of the situation 3 and 2. So you can have various other situations which you can name as number as 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever, differentiate, and still you can form a narrative. You can constitute a narrative. You can situate at 2 a.m. yesterday US declared war on England in whichever way possible. Thus there can be at any point of time and infinite possibilities for narratives. Therefore, infinite number of narratives can be possible. So Rolla Barthes, for example, in his work An Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narrative, would say that there are countless forms of narrative in the world, and in this infinite, so I'm quoting from Barthes, there are countless forms of narrative in the world. In this infinite variety of forms, narrative is present at all time, in all places, and in all societies. Right? So narratology is therefore the study of forms and functioning of the narrative. It therefore concerns itself not with the history of particular novels or tales or their meaning, but rather with the traits that distinguish narrative from other signifying systems, and with modalities of all these texts. Modalities of all these traits. So you can understand here that narrative is understood as a signifying system in itself, as a structure in itself. So its corpus, consists of not just extant. The narratology's corpus consists of not just extant narratives or extant ones, but all possible types of narrative. And according to Prince, the domain of narratology consists of all narratives, and not merely the great ones or the literary ones or the interesting ones. Right? So, coming to narrator then, just like in grammar, we have the distinction between first person I, for example, then the second person you, for example, the third person he, for he or she, for example. Similarly, I, where I is the one who speaks, you the one who is spoken to, he or she as the being or object that is spoken about. So just like in grammar, we have the distinction between first person say I, second person say you, third person say he or she, where I is the one who speaks, the speaker, you the one who's spoken to, he as the being or object that's spoken about. Similarly, in narratology, you have the narrator, the first person, the narratee, second person, and the being or object narrated about, the third person. So just like in any given sentence, an I representing the speaker may or may not appear. Like, for example, consider me saying, all the students of this semester are diligent enough with their studies. All the students of this semester are diligent enough with their studies. So here, I representing or designating the speaker does not appear, right? Similarly, in any given narrative, I representing the narrator also may or may not appear, even though there is a narration or there is a narrative. So consider the example given by Prince. Joan is rich. She meets John and she becomes very poor. So even without I, the designating I, you have the narrator. So there is at least one narrator, at least one. There can be multiple, there can be more than one narrator. That brings in the hierarchy of narrators, right? So there's at least one narrator in any narrative, and it is not always that this narrator be explicitly designated by an I. It's not always the case. So it's not always the case that the narrator will always be explicitly designated by an I. For example, in many instances, the I may not be explicitly, the I here, the I within inverted comma, may not be explicitly designated, and in instances where it is not, there may still be left, There may be left no traces of the I except for the narrative itself. For example, in the given quote above, Joan is rich, she meets John and becomes very poor. Then, all the students of this semester are diligent enough with their studies. Except for the narrative itself, there are no traces of I, the narrator, the speaker. So, for example, in this sentence, also in this one, Joan is rich, she meets John, she becomes very poor. There is no trace of I here too. There is nothing that refers to a narrating activity or a narrative self except for the narrative only. So sometimes, and then there are also times when I, within quote, constitute the only reference to the narrative itself and nothing else. So, for example, in another example, like quote, I log into Google Classroom, check the assignments, and then log out. Right? So, here you have an explicit designation of the narrating self I, but that's it. Apart from that designation I, there is nothing that you can know about the narrating self, that is about the narrator. So, here I only constitutes the narrating self, nothing else. We don't get to know anything about the narrator. We learn nothing except the fact that the narrator is recounting events in which the narrator takes part. So, we do not know anything, for example, what the narrator feels about this event, or what the narrator's own attitude is towards his narration, whether he likes this activity of logging into Google Classroom or not, nothing. So what we are trying to say is that we don't get to know any subjective part of the narrator. The narrator here is as good as the absentee narrator in the above sentence. Joan is rich, she meets John and she becomes very poor. Even there, except for the narrative, there was no, there was nothing known about the narrator except for the narrative. Here also the absent, even though there is an I that is present, that I log into Google Classroom, check assignment, and then log out. Here I is given, but apart from that, there is nothing much conveyed about the subjective self of the narrator or of the narrating self. For example, another sentence, consider, she takes a music lesson in the afternoon. So in all these sentences, therefore, the designated I, then she, Joan, all of this, between all of this, there is no significant functional difference. So all of this can also be said as, they act like characters. But then Prince goes on to say that there are, however, narratives where numerous signs representing the narrator, and not just the narrator but also representing the signifying function of the narrator, or signifies the narrator's presence in the narrative, are evident irrespective of the appearance of a designated I. These are signs of I, or you can say signals of I, or signals of the narrator. So we'll look at this briefly before we come to the narratee part, and the signifying presence of the narratee as evident in the narrative. In other words, the function of the narratee. Finally, the signals of the narratee. So signs of the narrator, we can say signs of the I. So, which we can say signs of the I. Now, the indirect way you can have the indication or presence or signal of the narrator. For example, when the second person pronoun is not explicitly referred to a character, must refer to someone whom a narrator is addressing, and will therefore constitute the trace of the narrator. For example, consider a statement like this. As you know, NRC opened a new gender studies class at English department, Kalyani University. So then there are signs of I that function more directly. For example, any first person plural pronoun which does not exclusively designate a character or narratee, refers to a narrating self. So consider, we'll surely agree on the fact that the COVID-19 curve in India hasn't been flattened yet. So also terms like now, here, tomorrow relate to the situation of the utterance, and when it relates to the situation of the utterance, more particularly to the spatio-temporal situation of the utterer. So in case any of these appear in a narrative and does not refer to be part of a character's utterance, then surely it's related to the narrator. And also narrator, why? Because it somehow indicates to the spatio-temporal situation of the narrator. So for example, she was here, now she is gone. So both here then now, for example, in the above utterance will indicate to the spatio-temporal situation of the utterer, thereby giving us the signal, or the signal of the narrator, that is signal of the presence of the narrator, which we are saying that sign of the narrator. So also again with terms like perhaps, unfortunately, class of modal terms such as these will indicate the speaker's attitude, and it is not part, if it is not a part of, say, character's utterance, then it will surely describe the narrator and the position of the narrator or the attitude of the narrator. Thus, even without any explicit designation of the I representing the narrator, we do have the presence of the narrator. For example, he went to the theater, perhaps he was lonely. So here perhaps in the narration indicates the mental situation or perception of the narrator or the utterer, unless this is not part of a character's utterance towards the being of his or her narration, and therefore this also acts as a strong signal of the narrator's presence despite an absence of any direct representational designation of the narrator. So once again I will repeat this, that perhaps in the narration will indicate the mental situation or perception of the narrator. Now this is when it is not part of a character's utterance. So perhaps here will indicate the attitude of the utterer towards the being of his or her narration, that is, he went to the theater, perhaps he was lonely. So this shows us the narrator's attitude towards what the narrator is narrating about. This therefore becomes a very strong signal. So for narratologist, perhaps will be a strong signal of the narrator's presence, despite having no direct designation of the narrator in the sentence. Right. So also the narrator, irrespective of the fact that it is designated by an I or not, can be found to have subjective aspects. For example, we can locate subjective aspects in a narrative to trace the narrator. Subjective aspects like intuition, reliability, distance, self-consciousness, right, prejudice, all of that, we can trace this subjective we can locate these subjective aspects in a narrative, even though the narrative does not have a direct designated narrator like through I, and yet through these subjective aspects we can have the signal of these aspects can serve as signals of the presence of the narrator, signifying presence of the narrator in the narrative, a function in the narrative. For example, Gerald Prince gives an example from Tom Jones in the case of a narrator whose intuitions are far more evident and direct than the previous cases, previous examples. So, for example, Prince quotes from Tom Jones, where I will also read it. So, the quote is, "Reader, I think proper, before we proceed any further together, to acquaint thee that I intend to digress through this whole history as often as I see occasion, of which I am myself a better judge than any pitiful critic whatever. And here I must desire all those critics to mind their own business." Now, note that again, narratologist would consider, even slightest evaluative adjective or adverb to serve as evidence for inclusive elements, and these inclusive elements can then in turn serve as signal of the narrator, the presence of the narrator, even though in the absence of a direct designation. So, however, for example, the sentence like, or consider this, "She walked elegantly," right? So, elegantly will be this term where one can look for evidence of inclusiveness on part of the narrator, on part of the narrator who is saying she walked elegantly. However, Prince notes that even in such cases it is hard to discern the narrator's subjectivity, especially in this case. Why? Because there's nothing or no evidence to suggest why she might not walk elegantly. In other words, it can't be said whether elegantly here is purely the narrator's interpretation. Right. So, there can there can be more obvious examples of the narrator's inclusion, like we said in the given previous Tom Jones paragraph, so forth. So I think we can keep about the narrator, we can keep till here, and let's move on to the narratee. So again, just like the narrator, the narratee, just like the narrator who may or may not be explicitly designated, the narratee is also may or may not be designated by a you, and in many narratives you may be the only referent to a narrative audience and nothing else. For example, consider this: you are very sick, you drink a glass of wine and you become very healthy. In this, there is nothing explicit about the narratee that we get to know, except for the referent, that is you, or except for the designation, that is you. So except for you, that may be the only narrative to a narrative audience. Other than that, we don't have any explicit reference to the narratee. But then again, as in the case of narratives where there are signals of narrators, Prince notes that even there are narratives where numerous signs representing the narratee and the narratee's signifying presence, and numerous signs representing the narratee and also signifying her presence in the narration or in the narrative is evident, whether or not you designating the narratee ever appears. So, for example, in indirect ways, you will recall, just as any you, inverted comma, designating a narratee implies a narrator, similarly, any I designating a narrator will imply a narratee. But in some narratives, signs of the you will function more directly and will represent the narratee as well as the narratee situation. So, for example, from the Scarlet Letter, Prince takes an example: we could hardly do otherwise than pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. Here, the reader refers to an audience. Also, there may be cases where the first person pronoun may designate not only a narrator but also a narratee. So, even the first person pronoun can also designate a narrator but also includes a narratee. For example, the quote like, "Besides, most often we did not stay home, we went for a walk." Here we not just indicates or not just designates the narrator but also includes the addressee. Then for situations like pseudo questions that emanate from the narrator are addressed not to him, when they are addressed not to the narrator herself or any of her characters, then it must be addressed to the narratee. For example, let's take a general example, like who doesn't know about the magnanimity of Sachin? Who doesn't know about the magnanimity of Sachin? This kind of pseudo questions by the narrator also gives stress, indicates about the narratee, gives us knowledge about the narratee. The narratee is directly, more explicitly, referred to in this, evident. The presence of the narratee is more directly evident in such cases. Then you have, for example, the presence of narratee will be evident in forms of negation. For example, when the narrator says something only to contradict the opinion of his audience. So again, to take one French example by Prince. No, it was not to see his mistress that Vincent Molyneux went out every night. So again, this kind of negation can reveal the presence of the narratee. Right, even there are affirmation by the narrator which will also which may also underline underline the presence of the narratee. For example, Prince takes the example of, yes, the days of the Lord are mysterious indeed. Right, so this is, yes, the days of the Lord are mysterious indeed. So here both the narrator and the narratee are evident, especially since we are talking about the narratee, because this refers in the sentence, this refers to a knowledge, a knowledge that is common to both the narrator and the narratee. Right, so any sign in a narrative that refers to narratee's person, the narratee's persona, the narratee's attitude, or the narratee's knowledge, or the narratee's situation, any subjective aspect that is revealed about the narratee in a narrative will constitute a sign of the, or signal of the narratee, or will constitute a sign of the you within inverted comma. So a narratee, and in that sense obviously the narratee may be represented in a more detailed fashion, or maybe in a less detailed fashion. And similarly, the narratee can act as a character. For example, just as one may not be explicitly designated by, the narratee may not be explicitly designated by a you, the narratee can be a participant in the event that are recounted to him. So in that case we can either the narratee may be a participant in the event recounted to him, or the narratee may not be a participant. When the narratee is a participant, may or may not be designated by you, one can make a distinction between the second person as narratee and the second person as character. For example, consider the sentence, you ate meat. So the character you is the one who ate, and the narratee you is the one told about the eating. So the narratee character can also represent for the narrator someone who is more or less essential, someone who is irreplaceable. This is Prince says, irreplaceable as an audience. Right. Again, for example, the other day I took the example of Scheherazade in Arabian Nights. So in Arabian Nights, Scheherazade would die if the Caliph refused to listen to her. So the Caliph is the only narratee that she can have. So here the narratee character represents for the narrator, that is Scheherazade, somebody who is replaceable as an audience, irreplaceable as an audience. The Scheherazade example is a very good one, okay, where the caliph is irreplaceable as an audience, because if the caliph refuses to listen, if the caliph were not the audience, then the entire question of acceptance or refusal to listen to the narrative wouldn't arise. In fact, the very occasion for the narrative would not arise in the first place. So this is where the narrator is compelled by one, or by a more essential narrative. So therefore, the narrative functions in a more essential, significant manner for the narrative to take place. Right. Again, the narrator also may be mistaken in the narrator's evaluation of the narratee, or of the ability of the personality of a narratee character. So the narrator, for instance, might describe the narratee as not very bright and think that he can easily lie to him, mislead him, whereas in another case, a more trustworthy narrator will portray the narratee as particularly intelligent and well informed. So these are various occasions, these are various ways in which the narratee can act as a narratee character and therefore be more relevant. Then there is also the case of individual narratee and group narratee. So a narratee may be represented as a group addressed by the narrator, or the narratee may again be an isolated individual. For example, in Heart of Darkness, Marlowe recounts Kurt's adventures to several of his mates gathered on the deck of Nellie. Right. So again, the group or narrative group addressed by the narrator often can be a perfectly homogeneous one where members are completely indistinguishable. The group can also be heterogeneous at the same time. Again, the narrator addressing several category of narratee takes advantage of the heterogeneity to clarify the message, right? He can pit one category against other, or praise one reaction while ridiculing another. So what Prince says, and I quote Prince here: if it is not uncommon to find a narrator addressing several narratees at the same time, it is very rare to find a narrator who tells part of his story to one narratee, then another part to another narratee, and so forth. So a narrative and what is more rare is a narrative in which a narrator recounts the same event in exactly the same way to two or more different narratee in succession, or a narrative in which different narrators tell the same story in exactly the same way to the narratee. So this takes us to the next segment, which is the hierarchy of narratees. So as there are many narratives in which there is only one narratee, there can also be many narratives in which there are more than one narratees. For example, in a given narrative, there may be an indefinite number of narratees. So when there are two or more when there are two or more narratees, the one to whom all the events recounted are ultimately addressed is the main narratee. The one who is told only some of the event is a secondary narratee, and so on. So whether from a moral, intellectual, emotional, physical, or social standpoint, narratees in a given narrative may be different from one another, and this introduces the difference of the hierarchy of the narratees. So another example where the narratee is described, that Prince quotes from La Paix Goya, Balzac's work, and I quote, "You will do the same, you, my reader, now holding this book in your right hand and saying to yourself in the depth of your easy chair, I wonder if it will amuse me. When you have read the sorrows of Pegoriot, you will lay your book aside and eat your dinner with an appetite and excuse your callousness by taxing the author with exaggeration and poetic license." So the narrative described here is different, you see, from some of the, so that this is one instance where from where we can draw the fact that we had made in the previous talk, that the narrative is not meant as the reader. So there's a difference between the narrative and the real reader. So for example, just the paragraph that I quoted here, it is explicit that it is being, the narrative here, I mean, it is directed or it is addressed to a narrative who may or may not resemble the real reader of the novel. So the real reader who is reading may not have white hand, for example, but some other brown or black hands, or they may read the novel in bed and not in easy chair. One may lose their appetite after having learned of the protagonist misfortunes or whatever. So similarities and differences between a narratee and a narrator, a character, another narratee, or a real reader, the distance separating them will vary, will change. It's not a permanent proposition, it's not a permanent situation, it's not a permanent recognition in that sense, I mean association, let's say. So even though the similarities and differences will determine our interpretation of and response to the narrative, so many ironic effect will depend on the distance between two or group of different narratives, or on the distance between the narrator and the narratee on the one hand and character on the other, or on the distance between the narrator and the narratee. So again, a narratee may be violently opposed to the narrator's value and much more or less reliable than much more or much less reliable than the narrator. And then one can look for different values that can be revealed by different reactions of the narratee to a given account. So estimation of different values can be arrived at, right? So anyways, it will let us know. So if we closely look at the narratee, the presence of the narratee, the function of the narratee, what kind of relation it reveals with the narrator or from the narrator, and what kind of relation does it reveal with any of the other characters, all of this will determine our interpretation and our response to the narrative. So I keep till here, and with this we wrap up with Gerald Prince, narrator, narratee, and again so we have been progressing from Gibson's speaker, mock reader, then Prince's narrator, narratee. Remember, in all these instances the text is still considered as a signifying system in itself, and we are only discovering ways and techniques and tools to get more closer to the text, as if there is something which is there, which had to be derived in the form of a meaning from the reading of the text. So the text still retains. So already we have entered into that movement which gives rise to this entire body of reader response theory. We will also note that with Walker Gibson, with Gerald Prince, we are still much, we are still working from within the confines of the supremacy or of the superiority or of the, permanence of the text situation. And we'll slowly see that how this permanence is, transferred into a state of non-permanence, into a state of into a state of non-permanence of the text. So and then we'll arrive at a situation where we will see that how the text and the meaning from the text is also contingent upon our position, our perception, our own of the way in which we perceive the text, and that it is all part of a phenomena where no neat distinction between the subject and the object, between the reader and the writer, between the author and the reader can be neatly brought about. And so we are moving towards that, right? Okay, thank you.